the University of the West Indies, the UWI, Professor Clive Landis, Pro Vice-Chancellor and Principal Cave Hill Campus, the UWI, Dr. Francis Severin, Pro Vice-Chancellor and Principal Global Campus, the UWI, Dr. Tomlin Paul, Deputy Principal, Mona Campus, the UWI, Professor Derek Chady, Deputy Principal, St. Augustine Campus, the UWI, Professor Canute Thompson, Pro Vice-Chancellor, Undergraduate Studies, the UWI, Professor Jonathan Becker, Vice President of Academic Affairs and Director of the Center for Civic Engagement, Bard College, Professor John Petrovic, Professor of Social and Cultural Studies, University of Alabama, Dr. Liakim Samaj, author and psychologist, Jamaica, Ms. Liat Ariel, PhD candidate in Philosophy of Education, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Mr. Martinel Bartley, President, Mona Association of Postgraduate Students, Mona Campus, the UWI, Dr. Felicia Marshall, Assistant Chief Education Officer, Ministry of Education, Jamaica, Mrs. Shelley Ann Gail Morris, Acting Deputy University Bursar, the UWI, Mrs. Bridget Collins, University Chief Information Officer, the UWI, Mrs. Lalita Davis Mattis, UWI's Legal Counsel, Dr. Patrick Anglin, Data Protection Officer, the UWI, Dr. Mark Smith, President, Jamaica Teachers College, Professor Charmaine Barrett, Deputy Principal, University of Technology, Jamaica, Deans and other members of the UWI Senior Management. I see Mr. Jonathan Archie here with us, members of the public and private sectors, students, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, participants in person and online, welcome and good day. Welcome to the Vice-Chancellor's Forum on Academic Freedom, Sustainable Development, and the Role of the University. I am Aldry Henry Lee, Pro Vice-Chancellor, Graduate Studies and Research, and it is my distinct pleasure to guide the proceedings this morning. I want to tender apologies for our host, our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Bettles, who is unavoidably and regrettably absent. He has sent his best wishes for an engaging and successful forum. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a very important day. The Oxford Scholastica reveals that the first university was opened in Morocco in 859 AD. It began as a mosque and developed into a leading center of learning during the Islamic Golden Age. The university is still in operation. UNESCO.org states that there are about 264 million students enrolled in universities around the world. Statistics vary, but we are told that there are about 25,000 to 50,000 universities worldwide. However, several colleges and universities have closed or merged in the past 5 years. These closures have been driven by financial stress, declining enrollments, loss of accreditation, and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's conversation is therefore critically timely. I want to thank PVC Canute Thompson for conceptualizing this important forum and inviting us to join the conversation with him. Ladies and gentlemen, how do we support academic freedom, fortify universities against existential threats, and harness their full potential for sustainable development? These are some of the questions that our panelists are very impatient to discuss with us. But before I ask Mr. Martinel Bartley, President of the Mona Association Postgraduate Students, to introduce our esteemed panelists, I want to invite the audience to participate in an online poll. So you will see on the screen a QR code, and I would like you to scan the code and answer the question: what is the greatest threat to academic freedom today? Because we want it to be an engaging session. We will display your responses later, but please join the conversation. Tell us, what is the greatest threat to academic freedom today? Those online, you also have access to the QR code, so please tell us, join the conversation, because we will be looking at your answers later. So I now ask you also to prepare your comments and your questions for the panelists as they present the issues that are so timely and critical. I now invite our President, Mona Association of Postgraduate Students, Mr. Bartley, to introduce our esteemed panelists. Over to you, Mr. Bartley.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Professor Jonathan Becker is the Vice President of Academic Affairs and the Director of a Center for Civic Engagement at Bard College, where he has worked since 1997 and where he has a Professor of Political Studies. He is also the Vice-Chancellor of the Open Society University Network. Dr. Becker oversees Bard's global partnerships, including its degree granting programs with the American University of Central Asia, Al-Quds University, programs in Palestine, Bard College, Berlin, as well as Bard's program with institutions in exile, including the American University of Afghanistan, Param University, and Smolny University beyond borders, Russia. He has worked extensively with displaced students and refugees, including during his time serving as acting president of the American University of Central Asia, and through the Open Society University Network, which will offer courses serving more than 3,000 displaced students this year. He has published several books and articles on international educational partnerships, liberal arts education, civic engagement, and the role of universities as civic actors. Continuing to Mr. Professor John Petrovic. He is a professor in the Social and Cultural Studies program in the College of Education at the University of Alabama. His areas of professional interest in teaching and research include philosophy of education, liberal political theory, critical theory, and pedagogy, and language policy. He has published more than 50 articles in a range of journals including Educational Philosophy and Theory, Studies in Philosophy and Education, Educational Theory, Journal of Language and Politics, and the Oxford Review of Education, amongst others. He is the executive editor of the journal Philosophy and Theory in Higher Education, and his recent books include The Commodification of Language, Conceptual Concerns and Empirical Manifestations, Multilingual Matters, and the Unschooling Critical Pedagogy on Fixing Schools. We continue to Ms. Liat Ariel. Ms. Liat Ariel is a PhD candidate in the Philosophy of Education at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research focuses on democratic citizenship, education in the post-truth era, exploring how truth is constructed through affects and lived experiences in a technological environment characterized by echo chambers and political polarization. She examines how these dynamics challenge not only epistemic authority, but also traditional concepts of rational discourse with democratic educational institutions. A Fulbright alumna and recipient of the Azrieli and ISEF doctoral fellowships, Ms. Liat holds an MA in the Cultural and Educational Policy Studies from Loyola University, Chicago. Her current work explores how social media reshapes young people's political perceptions and knowledge formation, bypassing traditional educational structures. In addition to her academic research, Ms. Liat is an experienced educator and program developer, dedicated to designing pedagogies that address epistemological challenges and post-truth era and supports democratic resilience. Now to Professor Canute Thompson. So, Dr. Thompson is a professor of educational policy and leadership and the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Undergraduate Studies here at the University of West Indies. He holds a PhD in educational leadership with high commendation, a master's degree in moral philosophy and biblical studies, as well as a postgraduate diploma in management studies. He also holds numerous undergraduate qualifications. Professor Thompson is a leadership coach, certified management consultant, a public scholar, and a social activist. He has several publications, including 7 single-authored books, 5 edited or co-edited books, and over 25 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters combined, and over 300 newspaper columns and blogs. He operates a blog, leadershipreimagination.com, where he publishes his own and other authors' articles. He is the pioneering co-founder of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning, CCEP, the Caribbean Leadership Reimagination Initiative, and the Philosophy of Education movement of the Caribbean. He currently serves as the director of CCEP and the executive chair of the PEMCA. These entities are located here at University of West Indies. Dr. Liakim Semaj is a distinguished psychologist, educator, and social philosopher whose career spans over 40 years of pioneering work at the intersection of education, transformation, business, and societal development. A recipient of the Distinguished Lecturer Award from the Cornell University, he brings both academic rigor and practical insight to conversations about the university's evolving role in shaping resilient, just, and sustainable societies. Dr. Samaj holds a PhD in psychology and has facilitated transformation across many sectors, including education, energy, government, and finance, on change management, leadership, and institutional culture. He is the founder of the Sankor Professional Development Institute, inspired by the historic university in Timbuktu, promoting lifelong learning and adaptive intelligence. Through his online platform, the SamajMindspa.com, he engages audiences in issues of freedom, transformation, and personal agency, values at heart of the academic inquiry and national development. He is a passionate advocate for learning without limits. We continue to Professor Clive Landis, Pro Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. Mr. Clive Landis is a Professor of Cardiovascular Research. Professor Landis has published over 100 peer-reviewed publications in the areas of inflammation and wound healing, surgery and disease. A more recent focus has been viral research with established viruses such as HIV, as well as the emerging viruses such as ZIP-V and the SARS-CoV-2. In February 2020, Professor Landis was invited by the Vice-Chancellor to chair the UWITV Task Force on the COVID-19 pandemic. This has sparked his most recent research interests on emerging viruses and policy responses in a time of pandemic. Over the years, Professor Landis has secured research grants and engaged in fundraising for the University of West Indies. He has fostered collaborations both inside and outside the university. In Professor Landis' view, collaborations are the engine of my productivity, and as an academic and as an administrator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bartley. A very long list of distinguished panelists, and we are looking forward to their contributions. So we are going to begin by asking them to do opening remarks. But I remind those who are with us before and those who are just joining us, I invite you to scan the QR code that you see on the screen, and those online, please do so and answer the question, what is the greatest threat to academic freedom today? We really want to hear from you, and it's going to be quite an engagement. It's not just, we're not talking to you, we are talking with you. It's a conversation. And so I have asked each panelist to focus on a particular aspect of the topic, And we begin with our own, very own Professor Clive Landis, UWI. And Professor, academic freedom, what is it and what isn't academic freedom? Over to you.
State the importance of it. I believe that academic freedom is actually a foundational pillar of peace within a country. So there are certain freedoms that you need to have a peaceful society. You need to have, obviously, freedom from bondage of any kind. You need the freedom to express yourself, which of course includes at the ballot box. But a very important freedom is the freedom to disagree with someone in a peaceful manner. And really, there can be no peace without these three freedoms. So the freedom to disagree with someone in a peaceful manner is perhaps under greatest attack right now in the era of social media, where you have this sort of toxic mix of online hate speech, trolling, cyberbullying, fake news, and censorship, which is eroding this freedom. And, don't get me wrong, as a community of academic scholars, we're certainly not averse to some disagreement. Disagreement is, in fact, a central part of the process of knowledge creation as scholars and students test the validity of each other's assumptions and hypotheses. And, you've probably noticed that I'm the only medical scientist on this panel, but the scientific method, which has to do with testing hypotheses, is in fact underpinned by a philosopher, and the philosopher being Karl Popper, who posited the falsification principle. In order for a scientific hypothesis to be tested, it must be falsifiable. And so it must be capable of being proven false. So actually, the freedom to disagree with someone in a peaceful manner is actually a fundamental pillar of academia. So I think, to wrap up, the university actually has a key role to play in society in promoting peace by having within our didactic space in the academy, we need to be able to show and demonstrate how critical discourse is conducted in a respectful manner for the advancement of knowledge and social enlightenment. So, as I said at the beginning, it's really hard to overstate how important academic freedom is.
Professor Clive Landis, and I ask the audience again, scan the QR code and also please prepare your comments and questions for our panelists. We want this to be a conversation. And so I turn to Professor John Petrovic, and I'm going to ask him to focus on universities as innovation hubs. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
So we are hearing you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I could not hear what Professor Landis said. I'm sure it was very important. And related to, I wanted to hear it because it's related to what I have to say. This focus on the notion of universities as innovation hubs. I think one of the ways that universities are innovation hubs is that they do the kind of heavy lifting that, for example, corporate America would refuse to do because there's no profit. And I think that's one of the threats to academic freedom in general is the neoliberal ethos across the globe. But this heavy lifting, I think, at university comes through doing basic research. And basic research is something that, again, the big pharmaceuticals will not engage in because there's no profit in that. And so we begin in the universities, begin the process of innovation. And it goes out from there. That's what makes us the hub. Basic research involves curiosity, the expansion of knowledge of a particular problem, with a particular problem in mind, but not a specific product. It's just for the sake of knowledge itself. So a physicist doing work on on whether or not neutrinos have mass doesn't have in mind any practical implications for that. It's just the pursuit of that knowledge. And other people can think about what are the practical implications of this? Where can we take this? But the universities, act as a hub in doing this kind of basic research. We're innovation hubs as well. The university functions as an innovation hub through the free dissemination of new knowledge and the free dissemination of different ways of thinking about the world. And I think this is important as we kind of go around enclosing the intellectual commons, and I mean that in kind of a Marxist sense, where you have an enclosure of the public commons. We're now increasingly seeing the enclosure of the intellectual commons, where knowledge is being stolen from indigenous communities, for example, and privatized and monetized. So at the university, it should be about the free dissemination of knowledge. And the focus, this goes to academic freedom, a focus on important questions that are not driven by the market. And one of the other threats I would say to academic freedom is grants, but I can go into more detail about academic freedom later. I think these aspects of the innovative university can be increased through the practice of interdisciplinarity. Unfortunately, around the United States, universities are getting rid of the liberal arts and economizing the educational process, focusing on skilling students as opposed to educating students. But I think the liberal arts have an important role to play in this interdisciplinary project to find different ways of thinking, to think about different questions, different kinds of problems. All of this, of course, requires academic freedom and institutional autonomy, both of which are under severe threat, I think, in our contemporary moment. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor John Petrovic. And talking about threats, we are going to turn to Professor Jonathan Beckett to ask him what are the threats to institutional autonomy. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, and thank you so much for hosting me today. It's wonderful to be here. There's no more important time to discuss this important subject. I wanted to say a few things in opening. First of all, that our understanding of academic freedom and institutional autonomy is rooted in our understanding of the link between education and democracy. If we believe that education and democracy, higher education and democracy, are integrally interlinked, then academic freedom is all the more important. And here I want to quote a favorite statement of mine by Bart Giamatti, former president of Yale University, who said, "I believe that the formation of a basis of how we choose to believe and speak and treat others, how, in short, we choose a civic role for ourselves, the basic purpose of an education in democracy." When we are talking about autonomy, I want to focus on two areas. One of them is related to government, and the other is to the market. So first of all, autonomy is always relative. There is no such thing as absolute autonomy for higher education institutions. As we've seen, there is no absolute freedom, and even an institution like Harvard, with a $50 billion endowment, is not free to teach, and offer curriculums as it chooses. Where do you need relative autonomy? As much autonomy as possible. You need that in what you teach, who you teach, and their access is really important, because if you don't have students, you have no program. Who teaches and how you teach. The greatest threats today are coming, as I said, from the government and business. The neo-authoritarian threat to higher education is very real. I have to say from personal experience, I was an assistant vice president at the Central European University in Budapest, which was kicked out of the country in an assault by Viktor Orban and forced to move to Vienna. We worked with Parambi University of Myanmar, which was removed from the country after a military coup, and American University of Afghanistan, which had a similar experience. And here we have a question of what can a government do to limit what academic institutions can teach and who they teach? And here we see a number of levers of power. There are ministries and licensure which can control what they do. There's power of the purse, which can govern how institutions are funded and spend resources. There are imposing people on boards of trustees of universities, which guide the very questions of who teaches, what they teach, and who they teach. There are now in the United States abuses of civil rights procedures, and there are even criminal sanctions. The other major threat, I think, which can come both from governments and from business, is this neoliberal threat, which views the university simply as a utilitarian entity, which is a means to get jobs, not as a place of thinking and civic life. And here we hear increasing talk of things like useful majors. We have a de-emphasis on long-term understandings and a short-term emphasis on training. And a de-emphasis on subjects which might challenge power structures. For example, USAID grants given to universities abroad in the United States, one of the words searched for cancellation of such grants was the word democracy. I think there's a lot more we want to discuss later. These are meant to be introductory remarks, but I want to raise two issues that I think we'll come to later, or three issues. One of them is, what are the internal threats to academic freedom? I'm talking about governments and a neoliberal approach from governments and business. There's a question of, in the future, what will the internal threats be? A second point I want to raise, and this is with sympathy to other people here, is the challenges of university leaders. I teach with someone named Jelani Favors from University of North Carolina A&T, who wrote a great book called Shelter from the Storm, which is the history of presidents of historically black colleges and universities in the United States and how they dealt with racial desegregation and the difficult position they are in. And this speaks to the difficult position of university leaders vis-a-vis governments. And the final thing I want to talk about, and I think we should address as we go forward, is how universities banding together through international networks like the Open Society University Network that I speak of can help preserve academic freedom and provide resilience to institutions which might be under assault from governments or business. Thank you very much. I look forward to the future conversation, and thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beckett, for telling us about the internal and external threats to institutional autonomy. Just a reminder to our participants, both in person and online, please write your comments and your questions for our panelists. This is meant to be a conversation, not a lecture. So please prepare your comments and your questions. I now turn to Ms. Liat Ariel. She's talking to us from Jerusalem, so really appreciate the time zone difference that you're joining us there. And she will speak about research students' academic freedom and dependence on supervisors and funders. Over to you, Ms. Ariel.
Hi, thank you first for having me here. I will be speaking about the position of being graduate students within academy in such a turmoil period of time with post-truth and governments that are sort of like trying to censor the academia and the freedom of speech that we have and try to ban the things that we want to say. It's something that is very much experienced today in Israel and of course in the United States as well. And what I will be speaking about is how important and essential is academic freedom for a meaningful research. And although graduate students are conducting maybe a master thesis or a dissertation, it is important for them to develop the skills that they need in order to understand how to create a research or how to come up with a research that is based on truth and on accuracy, which is something that's very hard to find today, where they grow up in sort of like a very politicized media landscape within echo chambers and within different sources of information, definitely different from those that researchers and universities researchers or professors are coming from. So since they consume a different information from what university leads, there is this gap that it's the universities or the professors' responsibility to sort of like try and close. There is this challenge that they have balancing between this like independency of conducting their research on the one side, and then on the other side, they are dependent on their supervisors and funders in university, of course. And in this sort of like relationship, the institutions play a key role, and they need to maintain this balance in order to help graduate students conduct a research that is truthful and that is very much related to their own cultural lived experiences, but together with the accuracy of the academy. And I will speak more about it. Of course, I will elaborate later. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ariel. I know we are continuing with our esteemed panel, and again invite you to prepare your comments and questions. I already have some forming for Ms. Ariel and others. And now we turn to Dr. Liakim Samaj. We are going to ask him about university community partnerships for sustainable development.
That was ingrained in my own academic beginnings. I started my academic life as an assistant professor at Cornell University. And 1971, I was just told, listen, you're going to be evaluated on three things: your research, 1/3, your teaching, 1/3, and your contribution to the state of New York. Because the College of Human Ecology there was part of the land grant. Even though it's the Ivy League schools, it was a land grant school for the state. And that impacted me so importantly. I wrote a paper then called Towards a Cultural Science, because I had a problem being defined as a social scientist. And with the strictures, you're supposed to be neutral. And no. I can't afford to be neutral when my people are being oppressed. I realize that, look, in any kind of post-slave, post-colonial society, neutrality means that you're siding with the oppressor. So that immediately I saw scholarship and university as a tool, a process, either of oppression or liberation. There's no neutrality. And it's almost a natural resource. Me being a scholar, anyone being a scholar, you can only take partial credit for that. The ethos of your society created you. You came out of the ground, just like how diamonds and gold. So you have a responsibility to put something back in the ground, first and foremost. So then I see the partnership between, as they say, the town and the gown was absolutely important. University and scholars provide technical, intellectual, academic pursuit for knowledge and truth, but it must be grounded in practical experience, lived reality. When you try to separate the two, you run into some serious problems. So that when I decided to walk away from the university, it was because, when I saw some simple, look, how many students could I facilitate their transformation so as to build the knowledge capacity of the society in a whole teaching career? One of the things I did, folks, I built a sound system, because I realized that when I draw a big tune in a dance, and people reel up, the impact you have, and it worked. I started keep that dance at my house on my sound system judgment every Friday night, and we would build the dance around one theme for the night. Let's say the theme was in praise of black women. Every song played was around the theme. And between 12 and 1, we'd stop the music and we invite everybody, let's discuss the topic. People started coming to the dance for the reasoning. So that it can be done. So that I've always insisted, we even right here in Jamaica, when we had 2 radio stations and 1 TV station, there was more knowledge in the society than now we have 39 radio stations. Because so much is contributing to nothing. So the university, scholars are a natural resource with an awesome responsibility, and especially in a post-slavery, post-colonial society, we don't have the option to, well, I'm neutral. Neutrality means you have sided with the oppression of your people. So we have work to do. We're not free yet.
Thank you so much, Mr. Samaj. And we continue the reasoning with our own Professor Knut Thompson, who is going to speak about the politics of knowledge production.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're having this discussion because there is a construct and an enterprise called power. Within the global space, there are centers of influence and centers of power. And power is about who decides. And so the question of academic freedom arises because questions are now being raised about what should we research, what knowledge should we produce, and how should the creation of that knowledge be funded. So the university's primary responsibility, well, I would suggest there are 5 major responsibilities of a university, and I'll mention 3 of them. 1 is the creation of knowledge. 2, it's the publication of that knowledge. And 3, the use of that knowledge to shape society. But the university does not have an absolute right to seek to shape society according to its own thinking. The question of what society should become is of necessity a contested exercise. There are multiple stakeholders who should have a say in determining what is it that society should become. The problem arises, and the reason we're having this discussion is because there are those who, because of the power they presume they possess or actually do possess, are seeking to dictate what the university should research, what knowledge it should share, and how it should do it. So my vision is that we are seeking to reconstruct the rules of engagement around how the university functions. The university should exercise its right, but it doesn't have that right in absolute terms. Exercise its right to seek to shape knowledge. One of the frightening things about knowledge is that every form of knowledge generated has potential power, or if you will, political implications. When a scientist, for example, makes a discovery using a justifiable and scientific method, Prof. when a scientist generates knowledge which challenges pre-existing, or might I say, other perspectives, that's a political matter. The scientist might find that it is not true that coconut oil harms your body, and that corn oil is better. But there was a time when we were told that coconut oil is no longer good for you, you should use corn oil. That is knowledge being used in a way to create a political divide, and those who had the levers of power were able to get the world to buy the view that coconut oil is not good for you. The same could be said for discoveries for the cures of cancer. A researcher makes a discovery which has implications for a pharmaceutical company which is using some other form of cure for cancer. And what are the financial implications of a new discovery of a drug that might be more accessible? So this question of academic freedom is founded within the context of who has power to decide what people should research, what a scholar should research, who gets funding for what research, and what research is kept buried and what research is publicized. So it's an important discussion. And what really, I think, is going to be one of the calling points, as I think Jonathan has said, is how universities are going to come together to form a power block that is sufficiently robust that it can contend with and contest the power of those who hold the purse.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. I'm sure that you were intellectually stimulated and you have your comments and questions. I don't know if anybody has one in the room with me here. Any reaction to any of the opening statements? Or you want to hear more from them? Okay, but before you hear more from them, there is the QR code that is on your screen. I really want you to join the conversation and to tell me what is the greatest threat to academic freedom today. So please scan the QR code. Let us hear from you. When we have a certain number, and I'm going to be instructed by my supporters on the far end there, who will tell me when we have a good sample size, and we shall display the responses. So we continue. Thank you to those who just joined us. I see some deans. I see our deputy principal, Mona. Thank you so much for joining us. So now I'm going to just continue the conversation with our panelists, and I'm going to just throw out the question. I don't know who wants to respond. Is academic freedom a privilege or a responsibility? Please indicate if anybody online wants to respond, any of our panelists online. I would yield to them rather than our in-house persons, because they will have a chance. Anybody online, our panelists, wants to respond? Is academic freedom a privilege or responsibility? Anyone?
May I?
If not, who is it? Okay, Professor Thompson.
I would say it's both. It's both. But I would believe that it is more a responsibility than a privilege. I think it is firstly a right. The scholar has a right, not absolute, however, to exercise freedom. And what is freedom? Academic freedom. I suggest that academic freedom is the exercise of judgment to undertake knowledge discovery or creation, and to share that knowledge through media that are chosen by the scholar. I think we should make a distinction between academic freedom and freedom of speech as a general construct. Academic freedom is not the same as getting up and simply offering an opinion that is uninformed by fact or research. The two are separate. But in affirming that academic freedom is a right, it is to be considered that in sharing the fruits of one's academic work, one has to do so responsibly. And perhaps the most important act of responsible conduct in relation to the sharing of one's knowledge, or the knowledge one has created, is to affirm the right of others to disagree.
Thank you very much. I see Professor Petrovic wants to join the conversation. Go ahead, Prof.
Thank you. I would just like to build on that. I think academic freedom, well, the first question is responsibility for whom? I think it's a responsibility of the state, of the government, to protect and promote academic freedom. In Spain, and that's not a universal notion. In Spain, academic freedom is explicitly protected in the Constitution. In the United States, it's not, for example. It's founded on case law that is very fragile base on which to build such a fundamental right, as Professor Canute was just saying. I would say that for academics, our responsibilities are twofold, and they're ethical responsibilities. I think we have a personal responsibility when we engage academic freedom to practice fundamental freedom, fundamental tenets of teaching and engagement, and that is to follow a principle of charity, to understand the arguments in their best light, try to understand them in their best light, and to also practice epistemic humility. We're never right, absolutely, and we should always enter a conversation knowing that we can be wrong. The second aspect of this, beyond a personal responsibility, is a professional responsibility, in the sense that we have academic freedom, as was just mentioned, is not the same as freedom of speech, and that engages what the American Association of University Professors refers to as a special obligation, and that is our statements can be used to judge our institutions separately. So now we have in place these statements of political activity and institutional neutrality, which throw a bit of a wrench in the work that I think need to be worked out, again, because I think things like institutional neutrality have become a form of weaponized pornography. But what I mean by that is that people don't know when faculty are engaged in political activity and breaking institutional neutrality. The guidelines of that are really ambiguous, but they know it when they see it, right? That's what I mean by pornography. And in today's climate, faculty are being censored for engaging, for taking positions. Again, as Professor Samaj said, we can't be neutral on things. But now when we take these different positions, we have to be increasingly careful in this time. And we do have this special obligation, so we have to navigate that quite carefully. Thank you.
Dr. Samaj wants to join in. We do have questions online, so I'll turn to those these participants who have posed questions. But Dr. Samaj, go ahead.
I see two critical components to the responsibility. One, and paramount, is to tell the truth. To be truthful. I mean, you can't falsify data. Yeah? And you can't make up stuff. It has to be empirically valid. But also, it's open to question and critique. And that's what's nice about the empirical process or the scientific process. It's not absolute. So whatever you found, there's always room for the continued discussion. But another component of responsibility that I have incorporated into my own self with my paper towards a cultural science is that, one, a scholar is responsible to not sit still when someone is distorting their research, distorting the results that you have presented. One simple way you see in Jamaica quite frequently, there's a poll. Polling is a scientific process, and someone is now, some media house or some institution is now distorting the results. Falsifying the data, so to speak, by taking off certain component. And I mean, there's a classic where you just take one component and blow it up and full. I think the scholar has a responsibility to come out and say, no, that's not what I found. It's been distorted. So even in that silence, you allow that distortion to continue. No, you can't do that. So the responsibility is broader.
Thank you so much. And we turn to our participants online. I'm happy that the conversation is going now. Question one, and I think I will direct this question to Professor Clive Landis. How can universities in the Caribbean protect academic freedom while balancing national interests or political pressures? Over to you, Prof. Landis.
Well, I think academic freedom is something which stands on its own and needs to be protected. But the way that we can, balance political pressures and pressure from the political space is actually to provide the example of how to conduct a informed, respectful discussion. So I've often felt that the space for disagreement in the current world seems to be shrinking. I heard one of our panelists speak about people living in echo chambers. They only hear one form of news. They're not hearing the full scope of news. They might be completely intolerant of another person's viewpoints or even hate that person's for their viewpoints. But actually, as a university, we have to show how it's done. So, I have colleagues in the Faculty of Social Sciences, in the economics department, who one well-respected professor would probably be described as a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist. But another well-respected professor, would probably prefer to be called a communist and refers to his colleagues as comrades. But yet, they can listen to each other. They can hear each other's viewpoints. Each of them will learn from the other, and they can demonstrate how you can create this enormous space in a university to have these completely polar different viewpoints. They're legitimate. They can be argued reasonably, and they should exist together. And we have to demonstrate how to do that, show society how it's done, because, there is just too much cancellation of other people's viewpoints happening, and it's very harmful to the peaceful conduct and the development of a society. So I think we have a responsibility to show how it's done.
Thank you so much. And the second question, because I really want the conversation to get going, I'll address to Ms. Ariel, if she's able to answer. Does the increasing dependence on the private sector or international funding threaten academic freedom in universities? The person asked for Caribbean, but I would put universities broadly, make it global. Thank you.
I wanted to first respond to the previous question and saying that we as academia have both a responsibility and also privilege in having freedom, not only freedom of speech, but freedom, generally freedom. Most people today around the world are not really free, and they're not free to present their opinion, to speak what is on their mind, to say whatever they feel and think. Some of them don't have even the necessary knowledge to come and speak in front of their instructors, in front of the professors, and that is something that is very important to take into account, because we have students that are coming from diversities of backgrounds. I can give an example from Israel with students that are Palestinians and that are entering the classroom, and they need a safe space to say what they feel and what they think about current situations between Israel and Palestine, for example. And I think that these situations exist all over the world. And this is very important to allow the classroom, to allow graduate students, to allow students within the academia to speak their minds and to try and think about those differences, positions, about the politics and about the power and about the fact that, yes, we are given money to conduct our research. And obviously then it's it's not that you can do whatever you want. You need to do it according to the people that gave you the money and what they want you to research. So it's very, very delicate. And these are tools that we need to give our students. We need to help them understand how this world works. They are coming from various histories, and we cannot know always what they go through. And we need to facilitate their entering to the academy and showing them, also modeling that, yes, this is a free, safe space for you to speak, to say your opinion without harming other people, without saying things that might, that might offend other people. But this is a place for conversation and for the promotion of freedom. Because if we won't do that, then obviously it's just a privilege that we hold to ourselves. So this, in this respect, that's what I want to say. And in terms of business, I guess that other panelists would be able to answer better than me.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other panelists wants to talk about the threats posed by external funding? I think, Jonathan, you may want to come in here from OSHA.
Yeah, let me
Yes.
say something to this, if that's okay, and then I'll just cycle back to what some of the previous comments. So first of all, of course, funding poses a threat. There's no doubt that people who give money often expect outcomes, but that isn't always the case. And I think it's important to recognize that as an academic leader, as an academic researcher, you have to create guardrails which allow you to respect what you're doing. I was once called out on a program we run. It's the largest degree granting prison education program in the United States. And this is something which actually unites left and right. For our left, there's a view of fundamental injustice of the incarcerated state. And on the right, there's a view that we're wasting a lot of money from a public policy perspective, paying people to be in jail when if they're educated, they have a much lower chance of recidivism. And I was posed a question, would you accept money from a right-wing group to support a program which educates thousands of students across the country who are incarcerated? And my answer was, if it's to do the same thing that we were doing, I would happily take that money. So it's controversial. Not some people in my institution called me out for that, but that's my view, that we have to exercise our judgment on whether accepting resources fundamentally impacts the outcome. I would also say that it's often the case in negotiating with funders, which I do a lot of, that you are convincing funders to support things that you were already doing. So that's really important. I want to say just something now, just cycling back to the last comment on privilege and responsibility. I think in terms of privilege, it is a privilege to have, I think we need to recognize it as a privilege to have access to higher education, and therefore it is a responsibility of institutions to consider access to higher education when it is shaping its programs. Too often institutions are ivory towers. They are not thinking about how to provide access to people who might not otherwise have so. They do not think about how they could prepare students who've not had educational opportunities earlier to do so. So in that privilege comes responsibility. I would also say I write a lot on what I call as universities as civic actors. And here I am saying that universities in its core area of should view itself as being capable of contributing to communities in which it's situated, first and foremost through providing education, but through the other types of activities it can do, be it legal clinics, be it medical clinics, and so forth. So the responsibility of academic freedom, of being an academic institution, extends beyond the boundaries of the university, and it's done best when the university is doing what it does best, which is research and teaching. And I want to say one last thing, because Liat is talking about graduate students. I would extend that to undergraduates. It's very important that we train undergraduate students, but we provide them the opportunity to find their voice so that they become contributors to society based on the views that they develop, based on the diversity of ideas that are presented in the institution. And that is also part of the university's responsibility. And the final thing, I will echo the notion that neutrality is being wielded as a weapon against institutions fulfilling their civic responsibility and against professors and students expressing their ideas. Neutrality does not mean that you have no ideas, and I don't think we can be or should be neutral about higher education and access to higher education, which is what we do most and we do best. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question for you, but I'll come back because I want to yield to the participants. We have Dr. Angling in the room who wants to pose a question, so go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good morning to colleagues here and the panelists. I'm enjoying the discussion so far. And I am wondering, and I'm going to take off from Professor Thompson's distinction between, I'm sorry. I want to take off on Professor Thompson's distinction between personal opinion and academic freedom, especially in a context where we live in a very polarized and polarizing world. Not everything which comes out of the mouth of an academic is really something substantial in relation to their research. Some of it is in relation to their personal views, their political stance, or some other thing that they have going on. And I believe that academics are unfair if they expect no pushback from society when they express their views. So this is my question to the panelists. At what point should the academic express the view that they are expressing, or indicate that the view they're expressing is an opinion, as opposed to something which is coming from their research. Because the public doesn't know that. The public does not know that you're expressing your opinion as opposed to findings from your scholarship. And therefore, they're judging everything you say as opinions because they don't know any better. And when you're attacked as an academic, you use the defense of academic freedom when in some instances, academics are not operating as academics providing information from scholarship, but rather they're advocating a particular political position in some instances, or other positions. In some instances, they're masquerading behind academic freedom. What is the responsibility of the academic?
Question, Professor Thompson, please.
Thank you, Madam PVC. Thank you, Chair. I think that's an exceedingly important question, Dr. Anglin. There's something ethically, perhaps obscene might be too strong a word, but ethically unacceptable when the academic, and anybody for that matter, but the academic, the scholar specifically in this context, masks his or her personal views or political opinions and preferences within or behind his or her academic work. I believe that a responsible way of engaging begins with making a distinction between what may be your personal opinions and what are the results of your research findings. But it's also important to consider that this notion of separating the self from the findings, or to engage in some kind of posture where your biases are completely blocked, I think that's a path that we should avoid engaging. Put simply, our biases are natural, and the way we interpret the data, the ways are informed by those biases. So I may, for example, have an ideological view about capitalism versus socialism, or about green energy versus traditional sources of energy. The lenses through which I see things are informed by those biases, and I'm not always even conscious of how those biases are informing my interpretation of the data. So I think there are three principles that should inform how we engage. One is, I think, mentioned earlier by Jonathan, or it might be John, about epistemic humility and epistemic tentativity. Absolute positions are not consistent with being a responsible scholar, because there's always another view and multiple other views. So that humility to inform our position. The second is to recognize that in addition to being humble about your position, that knowledge is constantly evolving, and the way you see it now, even you will see it differently as you discover new knowledge. But the third is to affirm that your deeply held biases could be at work in ways that you do not know, and therefore to make the declaration about the possibility of the interference of your personal views with your interpretation of your data.
Thank you. I just want to say that when somebody presents their research, we have to scrutinize the presentation of the data, the sample size. We have to ask them what biases they bring in, It's not just to present your data and say, 46% of persons found X or 46% of persons are in poverty. And even how we write and present the data analysis. So I may say only 46% of the population is in poverty. And then somebody else may write the same, use the same data and say a large majority of persons are not in poverty. So, and I can say such a large sample of persons is still in poverty. So you have the 46%, and you can use it depending on what your bias is. It's a large majority, or it is not a large sample. So I think representing the data, Dr. Anglin, how we represent it really tells the reader, tells the person listening where our biases are coming from. But Dr. Samaj wants to join the conversation. I have about 3 more questions online, so I will turn to them soon after. Go ahead.
I was part of a group that actively created the Association of Black Psychologists in the 70s. And one wonderful thing that I've lived to see, a couple of years ago, the American Psychology Association came out and admitted publicly that the psychology discipline was part of the oppressive imperialistic structure of white racism. One of my favorite books, the title of it is Even the Rat Was White. All the assumptions of the society, of the racist society, were codified in the science. And that's why I had a problem with quote-unquote social science. So when I saw that admission, and by the way, I contacted UWI when that admission came out, and I said, the Department of Psychology and Sociology need to have a forum on this to really publicize this admission. And they went through step by step, all the steps in which the psychologist sanctified by the American Psychological Association provided justification for all the oppressive forces that impacted black people's lives over the centuries, that they finally admitted that mea culpa. So sometimes it is you can codify these things in scientific jargon and so on, and it needs to be opened up in many ways so that people can see exactly. And oftentimes there's a thin line. Look, even in empirical work, what do you start with? An hypothesis. Is a fancy word for my feelings, my belief? And then you go out and you seek information. But the great thing about the scientific method that it never ends. So whatever you find, well, we find more evidence that supports this and more evidence and so on. But we have to be constantly on the lookout for that. And the admission that when in psychology, even the rat was white. So that we have a problem. We have work to do in many of our disciplines, even within the university, needs cleaning up.
Thank you so much, and I'm hoping the persons in the room have other questions, but those online, I thank you for your activity. And remember the QR code, because we are going to come to it after this round of questions. I'm going to ask Professor John Petrovic the question online. How can academic freedom coexist with institutional accountability and public scrutiny? How can academic freedom coexist with institutional accountability and public scrutiny? Over to you, Prof.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. I want to start with kind of a contrarian position, and that is academic freedom. I think part of the way that academic freedom is meant to function is that we're not necessarily always part of the marketplace of ideas. And in fact, academic freedom is about protecting academics from the marketplace. And what I mean by that is if people can control the curriculum, right, that would come from a very different kind of market. In the state of Alabama, it might mean, for example, that well, there was a Facebook post once that said, why do they, and the they was referring to faculty at the university, why do they think they're above the will of the people? And this person was talking about what we should or should not be teaching. And of course, it's about social justice sorts of things. So academic freedom allows us to be free from that kind of marketplace of ideas so that we can engage in different kinds of questions. Otherwise, the marketplace here might say, well, you can't teach evolution. You have to teach creationism, for example. So there is still some accountability, but I think this goes back to the previous question when Professor Thompson was talking, right? How do we explain these things to people? How do we justify our positions? And I think we have to be careful. I want to kind of push back against Professor Thompson's position that, while on the one hand, we have to recognize our biases, we also have to recognize that our bias, that we're not just speaking opinions most of the time, I don't think. Obviously, we have our opinions. But when does opinion, and I'm thinking kind of from a Platonist epistemology here, when does opinion move from imagination and hearsay up to the opinion that is belief, and then up to where I think academics should be, and that is to a level of understanding and a form of knowledge, not to some sort of absolute belief. That's where we have to stop short in terms of epistemic humility. But we all have positions, right? I'm biased in favor of socialism, for example, but that's not an opinion. That's based on my study, my looking into the area, my arguments, and I've engaged in various arguments, and we all do these sorts of things. Now, we can say, this is my position. Obviously, you can disagree, and let's have that conversation. So I think we have to be careful in being able to explain to the public what it is we do and why and how. That's kind of a form of accountability. The problem, of course, is the public mainly sees academics as when they're on some talking head show on CNN, in this country, Fox News, where you go on and you give, your opinion, and it's sold as just your opinion. And we can't do a very good job in that circumstance, because in the market, the idea is concision. And if you're going to challenge majoritarian views, you'd better have good arguments, you better have good evidence, and you better be able to have time to make those arguments. And it can't be done in this age of concision, where even though we have a 24-hour news on TV all the time, it's still in sound bites. You still have to function in sound bites. And we have not, as academics, kind of captured the ability to do that, because we simply can't. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope so.
Yes, thank you so much. We continue the conversation. How do we ensure that the SDGs are decolonized and made culturally relevant to the Caribbean universities and realities, recognizing its intrinsic Western connotations? I'm going to ask Professor Clive Landis the question: how do we ensure that our SDGs are decolonized and made culturally relevant to the Caribbean universities and realities, recognizing its intrinsic, I think it should be their intrinsic, Western connotations? Over to you.
I'm smiling because I'm wondering, is this a trick question? Well, I think our university has the answer to that. We are creating the ISDJ, which is the International School for Development Justice. So, the name itself demonstrates what we think of the SDGs. So the ISDJ is going to have courses which are from our own professors and lecturers on all 17 of the SDGs. the SDGs are something that we believe in quite strongly. And, when you look at the SDGs, coming from our viewpoint, when we see an SDG such as SDG 13, climate action, we know where we're coming from, because we are at the sharp end, the receiving end, if you want, for the sins of many generations, mostly of the large industrialized nations, and the pollution of the world and the atmosphere, and the warming climate. So we're at the receiving end of all of the damaging aspects, like hurricanes, African dust, which is pretty much all year round now. In many countries are seeing increase in things like wildfires and impacts on health. So we interpret these through our lens, and we have created a special school which sees the SDGs through our experience, and we think it's an ethical viewpoint, but it's also a practical one, because we're suggesting solutions. So, I think this is something I've always admired about the Caribbean, is that we have ethical viewpoints, they're quite strongly stated, but we come with solutions. And I do want to, if I can, I really felt I needed to just mention something about, where going back to Patrick Anglin's questions, where a academic ends and, personal biases begin. But actually, many of us believe very strongly in what we study. So in order to progress in our discipline, you have to open yourself to external scrutiny. Your viewpoints have to be properly defendable. They have to be withstand the most strict academic scrutiny. But actually, many of us believe in what we do, and actually we take it further. So, coming from my profession and coming to the Caribbean, I felt that the HIV crisis was something I had to become involved in. And so, I set up an organization, a charitable organization. It was, unashamedly there to try and help tackle the HIV crisis. And, so it's not as if I sort of neutralized my opinions. I actually embraced them. And of course, I published on it. So, at least 20 or 30 papers of mine would be on HIV in the Caribbean and the world. And that also then ties in with, where you get your funding from. Now, I thought it was a very interesting question, about should you accept funding depending on the viewpoint of the funder. And, in the HIV pandemic, there was a very important contribution that was made by, it was called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It came from the George W. Bush regime, and it had a sort of right-wing perspective. It was a little bit less about sort of diversity and, and different ways of living, sexuality, and it was more along the lines of, look, there are a lot of people in the world who are sick. Let's get them on treatment. And, no doubt some of it was motivated that the treatment should be coming from pharmaceutical companies. Many of them might be located in the US. But actually, PEPFAR broke the back of the entire global epidemic. And it may not even have been what was intended. Maybe there was more of a sort of a right-wing thought process behind the funding. But what happened is that by putting lots and lots of people on treatment, the levels of HIV in people's bodies dropped, and actually the whole concept of population-level control of HIV came into being. And through natural laws, if you have suppressed virus in your body, it's impossible to pass it on. And that is really what broke the pandemic. So, I would certainly not want to put too tight, controls on who is funding what. I think that's a very good example of funding which actually contributed a global good in a way that was probably not even understood at the time. And, I'm actually rather heartbroken that program has now been ended, because I think, those many decades of funding through PEPFAR, just like through USAID, have done remarkable good in the Caribbean and the world. And it's a great shame.
Thank you so much. We have another question on the SDGs, although I'm going to call Dean Sylvia Coenberg soon to ask her question. What unique contributions can Caribbean universities make towards the achievements of the SDGs? And I think Prof. Landis would have covered with his answer on research, making sure that our research takes into consideration our cultural context, our historic context, our race, our gender, our class differentials, ensuring that our teaching, both at the postgraduate and the undergraduate levels, take into consideration our context as we strive to achieve the SDGs. I would say in the advocacy that we do, that we take into account, again, the Caribbean realities. I just want to say, for example, we have the 20th hosting of the Caribbean Child Research Conference, and in this way, the university allows the Caribbean children to speak about the realities that affect them and to put forward recommendations about how their lives can be improved. So through advocacy, through teaching, through free research, we can make unique contributions towards the fulfillment of the SDGs. So I've answered this question. I hope the person online is satisfied. And now I'm going to turn to our Dean, who is in person at the regional headquarters. Over to you, Dean.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. My name is Sylvia Coenberg, Humanities and Education at Mona. And I have a comment which follows on the earlier discussion about institutional accountability. There is currently a dominant expectation that universities train the workforce and graduate work-ready engineers, bankers, managers, legal professionals, and so on. So this understanding of the role of the university, combined with hiring policies which privilege those kinds of programs, threatens, I think, the role of the institution as a creator of knowledge which informs critical debate. It threatens the role of the institution as an institution which supports the kind of broader intellectual development in a society which Dr. Samaj spoke of. And I think this type of role of the university as a creator of knowledge which informs critical and public debate is vital, not in place of, but as a prerequisite for inclusive economic development. To me, the expectation of the university as a glorified trade school, which must deliver workers to industry under the smokescreen of institutional accountability, is a threat to academic freedom.
Thank you for that interesting perspective. Any comments, Prof. or Dr. Samaj?
I firmly believe that there's somebody somewhere who's postulating closing down some universities and opening more trade schools and so on. That's so dangerous. One of the most profound responsibility of academia, of university, of scholarship, is the creation of knowledge and the pursuit of truth. And once we stop that, the whole society now starts to fall. Because the wonderful thing about the pursuit of truth, there's no end. And once somebody claims that, well, I have the answer and this is the only way and so on, no, that's a dead end. So the application, even in my own development, I started out in engineering before I found my space in psychology. And the survey courses I did, the humanities survey courses that they pack all kind of things together, as an engineering undergraduate, are still serving me today. Because I would not have been exposed to that range. And even when I decided to try and find my own space, I did this strange thing. I took a year of classical music. Now, what kind of madness is that? But I understand the language, the appreciation why many people don't understand something because they've never been exposed. So that whole aspect about the university. And I find it part of my own problem I find many times is when you're encountering students who everything, it going beyond the test, sir? Do we have to read the whole book, sir? When I hear those things, it depresses me. Because first and foremost, I mean, I love the idea. And by the way, that's why I love being in the private sector. Because I don't have to give exams. I don't. And, you know, and I teach more than I did when I was in the university. And people are there. And the questions that they're asking and so on. And it's not because of the curriculum, you're restricted and so on. But then you're pursuing knowledge. You're becoming broader and wider and a bigger human being. And universities can't give up that role. Not at all.
Thank you so much. You want to come in, Prof?
Thank
Thompson?
you. Thank you, moderator. I want to agree with the philosophical underpinning of Prof. Cohenberg's comments. And while recognizing that this thing we call a university is evolving, to note that the university began as a place of contemplation and reflection. The earliest universities focus on the humanities, the classics, and theology. And it is over time that universities began to create other centers where they create a school of engineering, a school of business, or other disciplines. But the core of the university's mandate and its central self-understanding was that it was to prepare people to be reflective, thoughtful, caring, and to acquire fundamental qualities about how you relate to each other, upon which you can then build functionalities and skills in areas of production and so on. So what's a central part of that understanding is that the university is developing a mechanism for helping the human being to be a contributor to a better world, which is where the question of this forum also lies, the issue of sustainable development. And Prof. Landis touched on that at the beginning of our conversation, where he mentioned that one of the most important prerequisites for the exercise of academic freedom is the freedom not only to speak, but the responsibility to affirm the right of others to speak, and that we can peaceably have our differences and speak our perspectives. And I think that there is in fact a threat to the integrity of the university, where it becomes a machine of production in specific skill areas, responding to someone's interest to have laborers for a production line. And that is one of the threats that we need to against which we need to guard, that of having industry dictate almost exclusively what are the programs that we should provide, because they are seeking to satisfy their business objectives.
Thank you so much. I think there's another question in the room, and before I take that question, just to remind everyone about the QR code, because we're going to display it after the next maybe 3 questions. So please scan the code, answer the question, what is the greatest threat to academic freedom today? We really want to hear from you. We're going to present a cloud of answers, so you'll see which one comes up on top. So please remember to scan those online and those in person. We really want to hear from you. So we have another contribution from the regional headquarters. Go ahead. Thank you. Try again.
Good. I'm instructed to stand. Okay, so my name is Professor Shermeen Barrett from the University of Technology, Jamaica. And sorry, I had this question very early in the conversation where one of the speakers spoke about universities as innovation hub. They spoke about the university as a place to get skills rather than developing critical thinkers. And I'm so happy I did not speak until after these two last interventions, because it speaks right to the heart of what I'm talking about. That is, I wonder if, universities must respond. Prof just spoke about the origins of universities, and if you look at what was happening in the origins of university, it was a particular period in history where, just as our education has evolved, so has philosophies evolved, and in that period, yes, that is what they wanted people to learn. You go to school if you are of the privileged group and you learn philosophy and psychology and all these other things. We have moved past that long, long ago. It is more than that. A university must contribute more to society than just whether you are what the kinds of things I just heard. And so I'm asking the question, I keep, the word in my mind is, how do we get in the margins of these two? The word here was the capitalist perspective versus the liberal perspective. There seemed to be an assumption, a hypothesis that if the opposite if a university is not contributing to the liberal perspective, then it is not functioning as a university. And my perspective is different. I am thinking that universities must respond to its context. That's what you just said. And if the context wants people who are able to be functionaries of industry, they must also be able to function in industry with certain cognitive capabilities. So it's not one or the other. And I'm wondering if we are being pushed in the direction as traditional universities to have research that is interdisciplinary, that's informing things. So when you create the bomb and the bomber kill the people, what is wrong with that mind? What is lacking in their development? Could it be that they have not been able to think through the value of this thing to society for good? And is it that they were lacking a liberal interjection in their learning? So the challenge that I'm putting to us is it one or the other? Or how, as universities, we can, somebody said it so nicely this morning, I'm writing down all the little phrases, we must show to the world how it can be done. And this is something that I'm challenging us with. How do we show to our society and our societies that are here this morning how to do this kind of research that's cutting across the boundaries of the liberal and the functional?
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Professor John Petrovic to answer that. He was the one who spoke about universities as innovative hubs, and I think he declared his position philosophically. So let's hear how would you respond to that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I didn't read the can of worms. Yeah, I don't think it's an either-or question. I agree with that part. I don't think that preparing students for the workforce to have a job, I think that's an important purpose of higher education. I think we can look at higher education as having a minimum of 4 purposes: economic purposes, political purposes, social purposes, and intellectual purposes. My concern is that at the top of that those 4 things have become a hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy is the economic forces, as opposed to the intellectual forces. And that's why I said that we're moving towards skilling people as opposed to educating them. And I think this is where the notion of interdisciplinary has to come into effect. How does literature, how do ideas presented in literature, how can that inform civil engineering, the way that we design society, or design cities, for example? I think there's talk to be had there. But we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to the public good to wrestle with how we do that in a more coherent way. I don't think we do a particularly good job of educating students on how this field can inform this field, or thinking through problems in their own field through the ways of thinking that are engendered in other fields, for example, in philosophy. How does a philosopher approach problems in a way that engineers do, or that could inform that sort of thing? So how do we need to be more effective in engaging that interdisciplinarity, but that also requires commitment to disciplinarity, because that's where academic freedom comes from, is the fact that we are recognized as experts in a particular discipline. So how do we move out of our disciplinarity while simultaneously staying within it towards interdisciplinarity? And I think that's the underlying question of the question, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. We have about 3 more questions, so I'll just yield to Prof. Thompson, and then I'll go to the 3 questions coming.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Questions from
I
online.
just want to make a clarification. I don't know if I came across as saying that it is either or. It's certainly not either or, it's both and. And in fact, when you look at the history of universities, whilst they studied classics and philosophy and linguistics, at the end of the day, they go on the sheep farm and they would produce milk and butter and other necessities, meat for the economy. So it's both. I think where the contest lies is this threat of shifting from this both and to focusing, as Prof. John just said, on a purely economic model for the university. And in that regard, there are those who want to dictate to the university what you're there for research, which serves an exclusive economic agenda.
Okay, thank you so much. We haven't heard from Ms. Ariel for a while, so I'm going to ask her question number 7. How can universities balance their traditional roles in knowledge creation with the growing demand for innovation and social impact? How can universities balance their traditional roles in knowledge creation with the growing demand for innovation and social impact? Over to you.
So first I have to say that being sort of like a younger generation in the academia, I experience this gap in terms of like, how do we understand knowledge, how do we process knowledge, and how do we understand reality? And I think that it's something that is very important that professors in the academia must do, is sort of like try to understand that younger students are coming from completely different experiences and different backgrounds of information. In order for them to be creative, they must have a space to come out and experiment whatever it is that they want to experiment. And sometimes it's very hard in the academia because it's very, very old in the way things are being done. It's very conservative. And for younger generations, they cannot find themselves within this framework. So in my opinion, and definitely related to education, if we want to create a place where innovation exists and when universities sort of like return to a position where they lead science, where they literally like contribute to the promotion and progression of humanity, of society, of science, then they must sort of like come, I mean, how they say it, they need to come to step down out of this like stage that we are seated in. It's important to be to take part in the communities that are around the university, to search with the students where and what are the problems that we are facing with today in order for them to come up and develop solutions, to offer them, to encourage them to write their papers, to write their seminars about the problems that they are facing within their communities, within their cities, within their neighborhoods, and to, of course, always reminding them that social justice is something that is worth to pursue. Sometimes everybody are looking and searching for like doing things that are related to STEM, to science, to like technology, to high technology, but research shouldn't be like directed only to this direction. Even though business and scholarship and funds and foundations are donating money for this, we in the university should also encourage and pursue and demand that research will be conducted also on topics of education, philosophy, theory, social science, social justice, humanity, topics that we experience, at least in Israel, and I know that also in the United States, are researched less and less. And faculties of education, of philosophy, of culture, are actually are closing because they don't have enough registrations, because students are not registering. And this is the most important thing that we need to do today. We need to encourage our students to continue and pursue this sort of knowledge, because we should not give up about finding solutions for poverty, for equality, for how do we understand truth, for how do we help those that are in need, for how do we resolve or how do we find ways to educate our students towards understanding better climate change, understanding how to discuss and have dialogue with each other. It's extremely important, and we must remember to do that if we want to continue sort of like control or being at the top of like a leading academia. That is one. And second, if we want to be innovative and we want to really revive and reimagine how an equal democratic, how can we have an equal and democratic and humane society and world. And this is something that we must strive towards.
Ms. Ariel, I'm going to ask Professor Jonathan Beckett to answer the next one. How can the university become more inclusive and accessible while maintaining academic standards and excellence? How can the university become more inclusive and accessible while maintaining academic standards and excellence? Over to you.
Great. Well, I'm going to answer that, then I'm going to cycle back. I think it's by looking for students where we don't normally look for them. Let me talk about 3 different programs that we run at Bard College where I work. One is called the Bard High School Early Colleges, which is looking for students mainly in inner cities, New York, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Newark, when they're still in high school, and setting up programs through which in their last 2 years of high school, in their first 2 years of high school, they have an accelerated program. And in the last 2 years of high school, they're receiving their associate's degrees, which is the AA, which is the junior college degree in the United States, and gives people 2 years credit towards university study. Through those programs, and for example, students in the lowest economic quintile have the highest graduation rates of 4-year colleges of any high schools in the state. So being creative, reaching students where they are, which might be inner cities, and reaching to students who we would normally be left behind and might not be prepared for university. Second thing is looking in unusual places might include prisons, which is where we've worked for 2.5 decades. That is recognizing the worth of incarcerated individuals and recognizing that they can contribute to society and demonstrate through their success. One of our great moments was when our prison debate team beat Harvard's prison debate team, our prison debate team of incarcerated students beat Harvard's regular debate team to show the worth of these individuals and to demonstrate pathways towards contributing to society while saving resources for society. And the last one is through educating displaced students. We are leaders in promoting the UN HCR's goals of having 30% or 15% of displaced and refugee students in giving access to higher education by 2030. And here we have addressed this through uniting with a network of institutions to reach students where they are, be it in Bangladesh, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Kyrgyzstan, be it in Kenya, to try to provide them pathways for preparation, which is critical, as well as university education. But this speaks to something which I think is really important, and I just want to cycle back to the past series of questions, which is we need to make sure research is really important, and we need to maintain that, but we cannot forget about teaching. We create an own goal in that way, in my view. For example, the rankings which we subscribe to, the Times Higher rankings, numerous of these rankings, which we try to compete in, place huge emphasis on research, but almost no emphasis on teaching. So you could hire a Fields Prize winner or a Nobel Prize winner to be on your faculty who hasn't taught a single person at your university, and that will substantially increase your rankings, whereas someone who's doing time job teaching a future Nobel Prize winner or a future Fields Medal winner, that doesn't count as how we perceive ourselves. Therefore, we're competing in strange ways which lead to insular production of knowledge, which is actually consumed by other faculty, not for the purpose of affecting knowledge or change, but for the purpose of raising our own rankings so our institutions do better. And the last thing I just wanted to say is we've done a lot of research based on our programs in Palestine, in Russia, in Kyrgyzstan, and then in partnership with institutions in the Netherlands to explore precisely how taking a broader approach to education, liberal arts and sciences education, can impact positively academic outcomes and employment outcomes. So our program in Palestine has more than a 30% higher employment rate for people who are studying the traditional humanities than people graduating any other university in Palestine, or most other universities in Palestine. Our outcomes in Kyrgyzstan, in which we're providing a broad interdisciplinary education and a core, are having higher employment outcomes there as well. Same thing was true in Russia. And the same thing is true in the Netherlands. And the reason for that is training people for the future. You know, if we are training people very narrowly right now in the modern economy, they're not going to be employed throughout their lives. And there's a lot of really good data which shows that people who are leading industry have been trained in not so narrowly, but in broader ways because they're able to make connections across fields. I will leave you with one note. When Steve Jobs, who actually studied calligraphy at Reed College, introduced the iPad, he had behind him a sign which had an intersection of two streets. One was Technology Street and one was Liberal Arts Street. We need to be willing to defend what we do, both for a civic sense, which is what I started with, which is we are creating future citizens, but also on the terms that our talented, knowledgeable, fluid in writing and thinking, adaptable graduates will be the employees of the future and are the employees of the future. And we shouldn't yield that ground to people who insist that narrow technological education is what will serve people over their lifetimes, because I don't believe it will.
Excellent points, and you've gotten a round of applause, Jonathan, from the room. So thank you so much for that. We go to question 8, Professor Clive Landis. It's a long question, but I'll try to read it slowly. How can universities in the Caribbean navigate the geopolitics of standing up and taking an activist stance on some major issues in the world that have divided the world and I suppose are being used as tools for providing grant funding and other political opportunities? So how can universities in the Caribbean navigate the geopolitics of standing up, taking an activist stand on some of the major issues in the world and that have divided the world and are sometimes used as tools for providing grant funding and other political opportunities? So how can we navigate and fight against the trend of what's happening in the world, being activists while we do so?
Well, I think it comes fairly naturally to us. So I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Okay, it's better now. I think it comes fairly naturally to us. I don't think we need to change our approach. Our approach as a university has always been an ethical approach, and we're not going to compromise that. But, you know, as I mentioned before, ethics in the Caribbean is usually allied with a recommendation. It's not a sort of hand-waving complaint about the state of the world. It is, we have analyzed the state of the world here from the Caribbean, and this is what we, recommend. And so, you know, this is hardwired into the way that we do our academia. If certain funders are not funding our research, I have not detected in any of the analysis of research grants which have been lost that we have been singled out. I think we're more like collateral damage. And, you know, it doesn't just take grants to do applied research. I mentioned earlier the research and applied research which I undertook in terms of capacity building for HIV. So, we felt that the best approach there was actually just to set up a charity. We ended up raising about $1 million US dollars for that, just put it towards training programs. So there are other ways to get your point across, to achieve your goals, than, to wring your hands about monies lost. And I don't think, as I said, that we have been singled out. We're not in the crosshairs for what we are saying or doing, but we just have to continue to stand our ground, do the right thing, and continue to be an ethical and a just university.
Thank you. And the last question before we show the poll, and then we take the last statements from each of the panelists. What do you think is the best way to ensure universities foster a stronger link between academic freedom and sustainable development research? Dr. Samaj, what is the best way to ensure that universities foster a stronger link between academic freedom and sustainable development research? Stronger link.
I think the best is to mandate it, bake it in. That it's not a matter of just there are contexts where people you just teach your class and disappear, or you just hide in your research lab all the time. But I think the way I was socialized, that I have to be three things. One, I must do research. I must be creating new knowledge. I must teach pedagogy. I must be interacting with students, transforming them and so on. But then I must also contribute, help to apply that knowledge to real problems on the ground. And I've seen so many examples of this. As a classic situation I had in graduate school, where this situation where this colleague of mine, he explained a situation where he was being told by the professor of certain conditions and of prison life and how it works and what it is. And he listened. But then he said, "Excuse me, sir, but that's not true. My father said that's not true." Well, your father's a PhD? What research does your father do? I spent 3 weeks researching in that prison and so on. Well, my father worked in that prison for 30 years. So that we have to find a way to that local, on-the-ground experience. The university are responsible for now. How do you draw on that and give it a voice, and you help to codify it and bring it into the mix? So you really have to bake it into the process to make sure it exists.
Excellent. So now we're going to turn to the results of our poll. I know we have kept you longer than we promised. And from what I see, and I've been sent the results, you will see that some form of politics is the main answer. Politicians, political interference, political censorship, fear of political retribution. We do have financing. We do have resource constraints, government. Artificial intelligence has come up under financing and political. Yes, I said this one. The unethical use of AI, legislative pressures. So we do have to wrap up. One of our panelists has to leave. So I will ask you, the panelists, given what we have discussed and also the results that you see in front of you, what would you say is your call to action for universities today? I'll turn to Ms. Ariel. So your closing remarks, what would you say is your call to action for universities today? Ms. Ariel.
I think that one of the things that has been said already is that we need to start cooperating and creating this comparative view of the difficulties and challenges that we're facing with today in a global manner and international, global and different settings, because eventually we are going through we are going through a very rough time with populism and post-truth, and this is eventually our responsibility to create knowledge and meaningful knowledge and to sort of like direct the future of education and of humanity. And this is a very, very, very important task, in my opinion, of course, and we need to do everything within our efforts to keep truth, integrity, and of course the moral values that we always preserve in order to maintain and preserve democracy eventually for the future's sake.
Thank you so much. And we turn to Professor John Petrovic. Your closing remarks, your call to action for universities today.
I think the call to action relates to the last question of what's the greatest threat to academic freedom. I think my call to action would be for faculty to regain control of the university. Faculty used to be, there used to be something called faculty governance, and I think that's under attack. And I think that attack is driven by the neoliberal impulse, which is a global phenomenon now, and that the effect that has this neoliberalism and the neoliberalization of higher education leads to things like what I refer to as the adjunctification of the faculty. We have 40%, and this seems to be an accepted figure. 40% of faculty are now adjuncts. Or contract faculty and not tenure-track faculty. That's a huge number, and it's a really good way to weaken faculty governance because you can't stand up. You don't have any protections to stand up to the managerial middle class, as I would put it. The provost, the vice provost, the multitudes of vice presidents that exist on university campuses. So I would say faculty need to regain retake the university, so to speak. The other thing I think we need to do is think more about, in terms of the questions of the distinction between the liberal and the functional, is to think more about flourishing, human flourishing. What does it mean to flourish? And if you're just skilling people and educating for them to get a job, that is necessary to flourishing. Self-sufficiency is necessary, but it doesn't lead necessarily to a flourishing life. That requires other gifts from the university and to take advantage of those things as students to develop the capacity for autonomy, to think through different kinds of problems, to have the capacity for rational deliberation among many competing conceptions of the good life. And when we emphasize the economic purposes of higher education, we lose sight of that, and we lose sight of human flourishing in general.
Thank you so much. We turn to Professor Jonathan Beckett, please. Your closing remarks.
Yeah, I would conclude with the slogan that we had for the Open Society University Network, which is simply this: what can we do together that we can't do alone? I think it's really important that we recognize that assaults on autonomy within universities, assaults on academic freedom are occurring across the globe. We are not without power to cooperate with each other, either for universities or scholars or students who are under assault, but also to build things across institutions which create new knowledge and do well by doing good, which support the notion of academic freedom, while providing quality opportunities for both education and research. I'll just give you a simple example. I taught a class this last semester on civic engagement, which had students enrolled from the United States, but also from Afghanistan, students from Germany, but also Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, students from Bangladesh. And everyone in that room, that virtual room's knowledge of and thought about their role in society and how they could be engaged with their communities was in part transformed by who was in the room, while at the same time promoting ideas and thoughts. I think when we think about the sub-theme of climate change, I think that I was acting president of the university, which is the opposite of West Indies, which is in a mountainous areas where glaciers are melting, and to think about the importance of having dialogue dialogue between people in different parts of the world who might be impacted by that, and to understand what an SDG might be from a perspective of someone from Kyrgyzstan versus someone in Jamaica or wherever you may be. So in any event, I think we can cooperate, and I think panels like this and opportunities like this are a wonderful opportunity for us to exchange ideas, but also to learn with and from each other, and we should be doing more things like that.
Thank you so much. Professor Clive Landis.
I hope that persons listening to this forum were able to see that we were disagreeing at times with each other. And, you know, I would go back to how important it is to be able to listen and learn from each other. So the poll indicated that the greatest fear amongst the viewers or persons who took the poll for universities was from basically politics, political interference. But, you know, that kind of extreme form of political expression could not happen if the knowledge base had not already been polluted. And as universities, we have to stick to our academic principles, but also our academic methods. Our methods, as one of the panelists said, if someone comes to you and says, I have the truth, then they have abandoned any pretense at being an academic. To be an academic is actually to understand that you can towards the truth, and that, you know, it is a pathway filled with errors, and that is part of the scientific method. And so, you know, it doesn't worry me too much when I hear certain absurdities being spouted in, let's say, medical science, which I'm hearing at the moment from government sources, because the medical scientific method is an objective one ultimately. And, you know, people can talk a load of nonsense, but it will eventually collapse. And we have to stick to our academic principles and our academic methods so that we can be bulwarks in this time of, what was the phrase that was used, a post-truth society where we are the bastions of the academic process which leads us towards truth.
Thank you so much, Professor Landis. I now turn to Dr. Liakim Samaj for your closing remarks.
Twofold. One, to stand up to authoritarian tendencies, because there are those who want to make sure that there's this orthodoxy, this is only this whole thing that should exist. And the other, to continue to broaden the horizon of students, irrespective of what they said they came to study. Because oftentimes, especially in our part of the world, many of our students, they're the first generation who graduated from high school. They're the first person who left the K in peace. So we have an awesome responsibility to help them, to fast track them into getting this broader view. Because, listen, social media is going in another direction. Media is going in another direction in terms of the narrowing and the trivialization of reality. The university has an even more important role now to provide that space where thought, intellect, understanding. Oftentimes when I teach the first section of the course, the first couple of minutes, so what's on your mind? What's on your mind? Why? We call this a university because irrespective of the subject, you're here to learn about the universe.
Thank you so much. And we finally turn to the conceptualizer of this conversation, Vice-Chancellor for Undergraduate Studies, Professor Knuth Thompson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I support the perspectives offered by all the other panelists and would sharpen a point to suggest that there needs to be an affirmation of the reality that what is defining the landscape or purporting to define the landscape of the existence of the university and higher education more generally is the power bases of those who hold the public purse and those who provide employment opportunities for graduates. But I think there's a lot that is unknown about what the university actually does and the methods it employs. And so I believe that one of the first things we need to do is to revisit how we have a conversation, how we have conversations with the, might I say, the centers of power, and to establish, if we can, new modes of engagement that would allow for us to appreciate the respective roles, the role of the university as the creator, a place where knowledge is created and shared, and the role of the politicians, the role of the public of the state in providing support for that role. I think there is an inflection point at which we are, which suggests that the university should bend itself to the will and wish of those who hold power. And whilst affirming the right of the state to question and to influence, what we need to seek to do is to create a balanced field for dialogue.
Excellent. We could have continued for another hour because there are so many questions and so many questions I myself wanted to pose, but I have to yield now to my co-host, Mr. Martinil Bartley, who is the President, Mona Association of Postgraduate Students, Mona Campus, the UWI. He will move the vote of thanks. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning again, everyone. So it's my honor and distinct pleasure to give this vote of thanks for this very thought-provoking session just now. Very interesting. First and foremost, I must give my gratitude to Sir Professor Hellebrickles. Although he didn't make it, but still heartfelt gratitude and thanks to him. To our distinguished panelists, Liat Ariel, Professor Jonathan Becker, Professor R. Clive Landis, Professor John Petrovic, Dr. Liachim Samaj, and Professor Kanu Thompson. Thank you for generously sharing your expertise and very diverse perspectives on these very insights. They have challenged us to think more deeply about the vital intersections between freedom, academically, and sustainable development, and the evolving role that universities have in shaping just and resilient societies. To our moderator, my co-host, Professor Algie Henry Lee, thank you for a very skillful handling and guiding of our session today, and ensuring that all questions were heard and every idea was explored quite clearly. Thank you. So, the team at UE headquarters, UWITV Global, your efforts behind the scene have been seamless and professional, so thank you. I'm sure the persons online enjoyed the seamlessness as well. To my fellow postgraduate students, to members of administration, to my fellow guild councillors who joined in person and online, thank you for your engagement and thoughtful questions. We're very, very complex at times. Forums like these remind us all that it's our academic community is not only to inquire knowledge, but to use that knowledge to push boundaries and challenge norms to build a better future together. As we leave here today, let's carry out the ideas and commitments that emerge from this forum. May we continue to defend academic freedom, champion sustainable development, and uphold the university's responsibility to be a catalyst for positive change. Once again, I must thank you all for being here and making this forum a grand success. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. And we are going to produce a document summarizing all the main points and recommendations. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks.